Picture two people, same job, same salary, same city. One of them wakes up every morning feeling like the weight of the world is pressing down on their chest. Every email feels like a threat. Every criticism feels like an attack. Every setback feels like proof that things will never get better. The other person faces the exact same circumstances, the same difficult boss, the same financial pressure, the same complicated relationships. But somehow, they move through it differently. Not because nothing bothers them, not because they figured out some secret to a perfect life, but because somewhere along the way, they learned something most people were never taught: how to train their mind. The same way an athlete trains their body, with intention, with repetition, with science behind every decision. This video is about that training. 10 principles, drawn from behavioral psychology, neuroscience, and over 2,000 years of Stoic philosophy that will fundamentally change how you respond to your own life. Let's start with the most important one.
Before we get into it, I want to address something most people get wrong about mental strength. They think it means not feeling anything, not getting hurt, not being afraid, not breaking down. That is not mental strength. That is suppression. And suppression, according to research from Stanford University, doesn't reduce the intensity of emotions. It amplifies them. The people who appear the calmest under pressure are not feeling less. They're processing differently. And that processing is a skill. One that can be learned. One that can be trained. Here's how. Point 1. Separate what happens from what you decide it means. In 55 AD, a former slave named Epictetus wrote something that would take modern psychology almost 2,000 years to fully validate. He said, "It's not what happens to you that disturbs you. It's your judgment about what happens to you." For centuries, this was considered philosophy. Then in the 1950s, psychologist Albert Ellis developed what he called rational emotive behavior therapy, built almost entirely on this same idea. Between every event and your emotional response, there is a gap. And in that gap is where your entire mental life lives. Here's a simple example. Your manager gives you critical feedback in front of your team. That's the event. Now, your brain immediately assigns meaning. I'm being humiliated. They don't respect me. I'm going to lose this job. And the emotion that follows, shame, anger, anxiety, is not a response to the event. It's a response to the meaning your brain just invented. Cognitive behavioral therapy, which is one of the most well-researched psychological interventions in history, is built almost entirely on this same insight. The event is fixed. The meaning is a choice. Not always an easy choice, but always a choice. The practice is this. Next time something goes wrong, ask yourself one question before you react. Is this thought a fact, or is it an interpretation? That pause, that single question, is where mental strength begins.
Point 2. Train your emotional response like a reflex. Here's something most people don't know about anger. When you feel a surge of emotion, anger, panic, frustration, what's actually happening in your brain is a structure called the amygdala is firing before your prefrontal cortex has had time to process the situation. Neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux calls this the low road of emotional processing. It's fast, it's instinctive, and it evolved to protect you from immediate physical threats. The problem is, your amygdala cannot tell the difference between a lion charging at you and a passive-aggressive email from your coworker. It responds the same way to both. And if you act from that state, you almost always regret it. The Stoics had a practice for this. Marcus Aurelius wrote about it in his private journal, which we now call Meditations. He described deliberately pausing before responding to anything that provoked a strong emotional reaction. Not to suppress the emotion, but to create space between the stimulus and the response. Modern neuroscience confirms exactly why this works. Research from the University of California shows that even a brief pause, as short as 90 seconds, allows the initial neurochemical stress response to begin dissipating. Your cortisol drops, your prefrontal cortex comes back online, and you regain access to rational thought. The practice is simple, but surprisingly hard to do. When you feel the emotional surge rising, stop. Breathe in for 4 counts. Hold for 4, out for 4. That's it. Not because breathing is magical, but because it physically interrupts the amygdala's control over your response.
Point 3. Build resilience by choosing discomfort. In 2013, psychologist Kelly McGonigal gave one of the most watched TED Talks in history. She presented research that initially shocked the scientific community. People who experienced high levels of stress did not necessarily have worse health outcomes. The variable that mattered was whether they believed stress was harmful to them. People who experienced high stress but did not view it as harmful were among the healthiest people in the study, healthier even than people who reported very low stress. What this tells us is profound. Discomfort is not the enemy. Your relationship with discomfort is the enemy. The Stoics understood this intuitively. They had a practice called voluntary discomfort. Marcus Aurelius would periodically choose to sleep on the floor, to eat plain, minimal food, to forego luxury, not as punishment, but as training. The logic was straightforward. If you practice discomfort voluntarily, you become less afraid of it. And if you're less afraid of it, it has less power over your decisions. Modern research on resilience echoes this almost exactly. Psychologist Martin Seligman's 3-decade study on resilience found that people who regularly expose themselves to manageable challenges, not catastrophic ones, but stretching, uncomfortable ones, develop what he calls explanatory style flexibility, the ability to interpret setbacks as temporary, specific, and external, rather than permanent, pervasive, and personal. In practical terms, do the hard thing first, the difficult conversation, the workout you've been avoiding, the creative project you've been too afraid to start. Not because...
Point 4. Reframe every setback before your brain does it for you. In 1946, a psychiatrist named Viktor Frankl was liberated from a Nazi concentration camp. He had lost almost everything. His wife, his parents, his life's work, his freedom for 3 years. And yet, in the years that followed, he wrote one of the most influential books in the history of psychology, Man's Search for Meaning. In it, he described a realization he had inside the camp that he believed saved his life. He wrote, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom." What Frankl discovered under the most extreme conditions imaginable is what modern psychology calls cognitive reframing, the deliberate process of changing the lens through which you interpret an experience. And here's the critical insight from the neuroscience. Your brain is not a passive recorder of reality. It is an active interpreter. Every experience you have is immediately filtered through existing beliefs, fears, and expectations. Which means the story your brain tells you about what just happened is not objective truth. It is a construct.
Point 5. Stop relying on motivation. Build systems instead. Here is one of the most misunderstood ideas in self-improvement. Motivation
is not a personality trait. It is a neurochemical state. Specifically, it's driven by dopamine activity in the brain's reward pathways. And like all neurochemical states, it fluctuates. It rises and falls based on sleep, diet, stress, social connection, and dozens of other variables you don't fully control. Which means if your progress depends on feeling motivated, your progress is hostage to your neurochemistry. The Stoics recognized this 2,000 years before neuroscience could explain why. Seneca wrote, "It is not because things are difficult that we do not dare. It is because we do not dare that they are difficult." The solution is not to find more motivation. It is to build systems that make action easier than inaction. James Clear, whose book Atomic Habits has sold over 15 million copies, describes this as reducing the friction to desired behavior. The example he gives is simple. If you want to exercise in the morning, lay out your workout clothes the night before. Don't make the decision in the morning when willpower is untested. Make it the night before when the stakes feel low. Your environment shapes your behavior far more than your intentions do. And if you design your environment deliberately, the behavior you want becomes the path of least resistance. Not the exception, the default.
Point 6. Your attention is your most valuable resource. Protect it accordingly. In 2004, neuroscientist Michael Posner published research establishing what he called the attention network, a set of interconnected brain systems that determine what you focus on and what you filter out. His finding was significant. Attention is not fixed. It is trainable. And the people who train it deliberately gain an almost unfair cognitive advantage over those who don't. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this constantly in Meditations. He returned to one idea again and again: the present moment. Not the future, which doesn't exist yet. Not the past, which cannot be changed. The present. Because the present moment is the only place where your attention can actually do anything. Modern research on mindfulness has consistently validated this. A landmark Harvard study led by psychologist Matthew Killingsworth tracked people's attention in real time using a smartphone app. The finding? People spend nearly 47% of their waking hours thinking about something other than what they're doing. And that mind wandering was consistently associated with lower happiness, regardless of what they were actually doing at the time. The activity didn't determine happiness, the presence of attention did. The practice here is not meditation in the traditional sense. It's simpler. Pick one thing. Do only that thing. Notice when your mind pulls away and bring it back. That noticing and returning is the training. And like any training, it gets easier the more you do it.
Point 7. Prepare for the worst to appreciate what you have. This one sounds counterintuitive. In a culture that emphasizes positive thinking, being told to think about the worst case scenario feels wrong. But the Stoics had a reason for it. They called it premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. Marcus Aurelius practiced it daily. Each morning he would mentally rehearse the difficulties he might face that day. Not to catastrophize, not to generate fear, but to remove the element of surprise from adversity. Because when something goes wrong for someone who has mentally rehearsed it, it lands differently. Modern psychology has studied this under the name defensive pessimism. Research by psychologist Julie Norham found that people who mentally simulate negative outcomes before a challenge perform significantly better than those who rely purely on positive thinking. Not because negativity is helpful, but because realistic preparation reduces anxiety in the moment. And there's a second benefit the Stoics identified that psychology has also confirmed. When you vividly imagine losing something, your health, your relationships, your career, your appreciation for it increases immediately. Psychologists call this negative visualization's gratitude effect, and it's measurable. Studies on what researchers call mental subtraction
imagining life without something you currently have, consistently show increases in reported well-being and gratitude. The practice is simple.
Point 8. Your social environment is shaping your brain, whether you chose it deliberately or not. In 2007, social scientists Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler published a landmark study in the New England Journal of Medicine. They found that happiness spreads through social networks like a virus. If a close friend becomes happy, your probability of becoming happy increases by 15%. If a friend of a friend becomes happy, it increases by 10%. 3 degrees of separation away, it still increases by 6%. The same was true for depression, for obesity, for loneliness. Your emotional state is not as internally generated as you might think. It is partially contagious. Epictetus understood this long before the research existed. He wrote, "Tell me who you spend time with, and I will tell you who you are becoming." Not who you are becoming. Because proximity is a process, not a snapshot. This does not mean cutting everyone out of your life who struggles. It means being intentional about where you spend the majority of your attention and your time. It means actively seeking out people who are operating at the level you want to reach. Not because you're using them, but because the research is clear. The fastest way to change your habits, your mindset, and your emotional baseline is to change the environment you're most exposed to. And the most powerful part of that environment is the people in it.
Point 9. Accept impermanence. Not as resignation, as liberation. The Stoics had a phrase for this: memento mori. Remember that you will die. To modern ears, that sounds morbid. But to the Stoics, it was the opposite. It was clarifying. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think." He wasn't being dark. He was being precise. Because when you genuinely accept that nothing is permanent, not the good things, not the bad things, not the people you love, not the circumstances you fear, something shifts. The things that used to feel urgent start to feel trivial. The things that used to feel trivial start to feel precious. Modern psychology has studied this under the lens of mortality salience, the awareness of one's own death and how it affects behavior. Research by psychologist Jeff Greenberg found that people who regularly contemplate their own mortality make significantly more values-aligned decisions.
Point 10. Act despite fear. Not after fear disappears, despite it. This is the one that separates people who talk about mental strength from people who actually build it. Because every principle in this video means nothing if it stays in your head. The Stoics were not philosophers who sat in rooms thinking. Marcus Aurelius led armies. Seneca navigated the most dangerous political environment in Rome. Epictetus, a former slave, built a school that outlasted empires. They thought deeply, and then they acted. Susan Jeffers, psychologist and author of Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway, spent decades researching what separates people who take action from those who stay paralyzed. Her conclusion was simple. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the judgment that something else is more important than the fear. Neuroscience supports this. Research on action and self-efficacy from psychologist Albert Bandura shows that the single strongest predictor of future confidence is not positive thinking. It's not visualization. It's past action. Every time you do something despite being afraid, your brain updates its model of what you're capable of. Not dramatically, not all at once, but consistently. Each small act of courage rewires the neural pathways associated with that type of challenge, making the next act of courage slightly easier, and the one after that, easier still. The fear does not have to
to go away before you begin. It just has to become less important than what you're moving toward. That is mental strength. Not the absence of fear. The decision to move anyway.
10 principles. Some 2,000 years old. Some discovered last decade in a research lab. All pointing to the same truth. Your mind is not fixed. It is not set in stone by your childhood, your genetics, or your circumstances. It is adaptive, trainable, responsive to what you repeatedly expose it to. Separate events from the meaning you assign to them. Train your emotional response before you need it. Choose discomfort deliberately. Reframe every setback before your brain does it for you. Build systems, not motivation. Protect your attention like the resource it is. Prepare for difficulty so it cannot surprise you. Choose your environment with the same care you'd choose anything else that shapes you. Accept impermanence, not as loss, but as clarity. And act, despite the fear. Because the mind you have today is not the mind you're stuck with. It's the mind you're starting with. And what you do with it from here is entirely up to you. If this gave you something to think about, the next video goes deeper into the specific daily habits that the most mentally resilient people share across cultures and centuries. I'll see you there.